So back again. Let's continue. So we just did pyruvic acid grooming. Let's move on to the citric acid cycle. Yep, saying it again and again. Don't freak out about this because I will explain it to you. And for a while, we're just going to follow the carbons through here anyway, okay? All right, citric acid cycle. This would be step number 3, by the way. Okay. All right, so we're going to start right here. There's our acetyl-CoA, which, as you remember, came out of pyruvic acid grooming. We started with 6-carbon glucose, 2 3-carbon pyruvates, and now we're at 2 2-carbon acetyl-CoAs. Okay. Well, once the acetyl-CoA gets into this next step, which is the citric acid cycle, the coenzyme A is actually going to drop off because its job as the enzyme was to get this reaction, the citric acid cycle, started. So once it gets in here, it drops off our 2-carbon compound, which is called acetic acid, but you don't have to know that. It drops it off, and then the coenzyme A is going to go back to pyruvic acid grooming, okay, to go over the process again. We're just looking at carbons, right? So our 2-carbon acetic acid is going to be joined by a 4-carbon compound right here. This is called sometimes I can't spell. It's an A, oxaloacetate. Okay, you do need to know the name of this. This 4-carbon oxaloacetate comes around and it's going to pick up our 2-carbon acetic acid. Basically, what I remember is this 4-carbon molecule picks up this 2-carbon molecule. 4 plus 2 equals 6. Okay, this 6-carbon compound that it forms is not glucose. Glucose had 6, this has 6, but they are not the same. In fact, this compound is citric acid. This is where the cycle gets its name. Okay, acetyl-CoA comes in, drops off the 2 carbons. The CoA goes back to pyruvic acid grooming. The 4-carbon oxaloacetate picks up this 2 carbons that just came in, and it forms a 6-carbon citric acid. Okay, now stuff's going to happen, and we're just going to watch the carbons. Notice that as we go around our cycle here, we have carbon dioxide forming. What does that mean? Where did the carbon come from? Came from our 6-carbon, right? So we've lost a carbon. And now we're here at this 5-carbon compound. Sorry, it's gonna take forever for my voice to clear up. Look again. We have another carbon dioxide being formed, meaning we've lost another carbon. So now we're down to a 4-carbon compound, okay? We don't lose any more carbons after this. This is another 4-carbon compound until we get back to this one. This one is oxaloacetate. These other 2 4-carbons aren't. They are other compounds that you don't need to worry about the names of. Okay? And then this oxaloacetate picks up the next 2 carbons that have been brought in from pyruvic acid grooming, and the cycle starts over. Again, here's the cycle part of it, right? Oxaloacetate picks up 2 carbons, becomes citric acid. We lose a carbon to carbon dioxide, and we end up with a 5-carbon compound. Then we lose another carbon to carbon dioxide, and we end up with a 4-carbon compound, then another 4-carbon compound, and then we're back to oxaloacetate again. Okay? Cycle just happens over and over again. I had, was it a student or was that mine? I don't know. I think one year when I was teaching this, I was talking about being stuck on It's a Small World at Disneyland. If you've ever been stuck on that ride, it gets to be a bit of a nightmare. And so we talked about there's already 4 people in the boat for It's a Small World. They come around and pick up you and your friend. Now there's 6 of you in the It's a Small World boat. Along the way, the ride breaks down and you're stuck. So your friend decides to bail right there. Now it's you and 5 people, or 4 other people that were already on the boat, okay? The ride's still stuck down, or shut down, so you bail as well. Now you're gone. Now it's just the same 4 schmucks that were on the boat to begin with. They finally make it through the ride and they come back and pick up 2 new people and the process starts all over again, okay? Kind of a random way to think about it, for sure, but you have to find a way that these steps will stick in your head, that you understand what's happening, even if you're not using the terms carbon. Okay, so again, 4 carbon meets 2 carbon, makes 6 carbon, loses a carbon, 5 carbon, loses a carbon, 4 carbon, different 4 carbon, oxaloacetate, okay? That's where we're actually gonna stop following the carbons. We're gonna stop here. So what I wanna do real quick is my whiteboard and let me show you how I usually do this part to try to make it a little more clear. We're going to start with our original 6 carbon compound. Remember what that was called? It's glucose, right? Our glucose is going to get split into 2 3 carbon compounds. And they're called pyruvates. Okay. This step right here, where this happens, where we go from glucose to our pyruvates, this step is glycolysis. We have glucose, goes through glycolysis, we end up with 2, 3 carbon pyruvates. Okay, then from there, we end up with our 2 carbon with a coenzyme attached. Remember what this is called? These are acetyl-CoA. What was this step that happened here where we went from our pyruvate to acetyl-CoA? It's pyruvic acid grooming. Good name for it now, right? Okay. Then we take our acetyl-CoA, we come in here to the next step, CoA leaves, so we just have our 2 carbon, and it's going to meet our 4 carbon oxaloacetate. And if you want to know, this is acetic acid. Okay, so our 2 carbons plus the 4 carbons gives us another 6 carbon. And this is called citric acid. Okay, and our citric acid is going to lose 1 to carbon dioxide. So now we have 5 carbons, and then it's going to lose another 1 to carbon dioxide. So we're back to 4 carbons And then eventually this comes back up to oxaloacetate and the process starts over. What's this process called? This process is the citric acid cycle. Okay, so we have glycolysis, pyruvic acid grooming, the citric acid cycle. As I just drew all over that. Okay. That's following the carbons. Obviously that's going to be repeated on this side as well. I'm not going to draw it all out, but what happened here happens over here too. Okay. This is what I mean by following the carbons. You can watch this get cut down into smaller and smaller pieces from our great big glucose to eventually just the acetic acid, right? And then it goes through the citric acid cycle, and there's some other stuff that happens in the citric acid cycle as well. But this is as far as we're going to follow those carbons, okay? All right, I'm going to go back here. To the citric acid cycle. Now, we've already followed the carbons through here. So we've taken that out. You don't need to look at the carbons anymore for our carbon dioxide because you already know what's happening. So now we're going to look at electrons. Okay? Well, all we have to do is find our Ubers. And here they are. Here's our NAD+, 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 and down here, let me introduce lift. It's called FAD. Okay? So if NAD+ is Uber, FAD is lift. Same service, slightly different molecule. That's it. Okay? Remember that NAD+ is the oxidized form because it doesn't have any electrons attached. But during this process of the citric acid cycle, electrons are going to come off, and they're going to be picked up by our electron carriers, NAD+ and FAD, and then those are going to be reduced to form NADH and FADH2. Okay? Yeah? So there's 4 places where we have electrons coming off. Here by NAD+, here by NAD+, here by FAD, here by NAD+. Okay? Where are all these electrons going? We saw electrons in pyruvic acid grooming where we first met NAD+, and we've got a bunch of them happening now. Where are they going? Well, they're going to what I call, as I've said, I think, the party at the electron transport chain. So our electrons are going to the electron transport chain. It is a party that, you know, any electron who's knows what's up is going to want to be at this party. Doesn't it just sound amazing? It is hip. Okay, so anyway, that's where the electron carriers are going, right? The last thing I want you to see here is that we do get a little tiny bit of ATP right there. We get 1, okay? 1 ATP. So each turn of the citric acid cycle gives or yields, we get 3 NADH, 1, 2, 3. We get 1 FADH2, and we get 1 ATP. Okay? So that's per turn. So if we want to know how many per glucose, we're going to double that. 6 NADH, 2 FADH2, 2 ATP. Okay? So it's per turn. Okay? All right, quick recap of what's happening in the citric acid cycle. Start with the carbons. 2 carbon acetyl-CoA comes in. The coenzyme A drops off. It goes back to the pyruvic acid grooming. And it leaves our 2-carbon acetic acid here. Our 4-carbon oxaloacetate comes around the cycle and it picks up our 2-carbon acetic acid to make a 6-carbon citric acid. Okay? As this chemical reaction cycle happens, we lose a carbon to carbon dioxide, so we have a 5-carbon compound. Then we lose another carbon to form carbon dioxide, so now we're back to 4 carbons. And then a different 4-carbon, and then finally to oxaloacetate again, where it's going to pick up new carbons coming from pyruvic acid grooming and start over. That's the carbons. Electrons, we have NAD plus in 3 different places, 1, 2, 3, picking up electrons and being reduced to form NADH. Then we have FAD right here in this one spot that's going to also pick up electrons to be reduced and form FADH2. Those electron carriers are taking those electrons to the party at the electron transport chain. And then finally, we get 1 ATP from this process. Okay? There we go. And we just deciphered all the crap on this page. If you just take it in little pieces, it's not overwhelming. When you just stare at this, it's like your head's gonna explode. I totally get it. Don't let your head explode. That's sad. Take it a piece at a time. Let's go to the party. Doesn't that look like a party? I mean, come on, guys. Look at this. Look at this. Again, no freaking out. We've already learned that we can dissect a diagram, so you don't need to worry about what all these different pieces are because we're just going to take it one at a time. All right. First, we have these big purple guys, which are essentially a bunch of protein complexes. They're proteins that have a special job that they're going to do for our energy production. Within them, we have little electron carrier complexes that are going to pass electrons from one person to another, kind of like if you're playing hot potato. They're going to play hot potato with electrons. Okay? Remember I told you that the electron carriers, Uber and Lyft, are going to come and drop their electrons off here? Here they are, right here. Okay? Here's our NADH. NADH drops off its electrons and it becomes oxidized back to NAD+. NAD+ being Uber, right, for electrons, goes back to pick up more electrons someplace along the line in cellular respiration. And then here's FADH2. FADH2 is going to drop its electrons off and be oxidized back to FAD. As a side note, I always get asked what these stand for. NAD is nicotinamide adenine diphosphate, and FAD is flavonoid adenine diphosphate. Okay, you can see what I call them, NAD and FAD. Alrighty then, so our electrons are being dropped off. And again, they're getting dropped off to all these little electron carriers in these protein complexes that are now going to play hot potato and pass them along. All right, do you remember how we have hydrogens attached to our electron carriers, NADH and FADH? It's because those electrons are actually being moved as part of a hydrogen atom. Remember that hydrogen atoms have 1 proton and 1 electron. And hydrogen is super willing to give up its electron. It would rather not have one, okay? So when the electron carriers drop these off, the electrons and the protons and hydrogen separate. We have the electrons going down the electron transport chain, and then we have the protons that are going to form something called a proton gradient. We'll talk about that in a second. Let's do our hot potato electron carriers. Notice that it is being, again, passed. The electrons are being passed from one to another in this chain, okay, until we reach the bottom. Why is it doing that? Every time it passes, it's giving off, the electrons are giving off little bits of energy, okay? Why go through this process where you're like giving off a little bit of energy every time it gets passed? Why not just get there and release all the energy? Why wouldn't it do that? Any guesses? Okay. You know when you put gas in your engine in your car is set to burn small amounts of fuel at a time, right? A bunch of mini combustions that are gonna make your car drive. And doing that means you can fill up your tank and you can get several hours away on that one tank of gas because it's letting off that energy from the gas little bits at a time. What would happen if instead of that, when you put gas in your car and you turn the engine on, all of the gas in your tank ignites at once? Right? Kaboom. Big old explosion, because the amount of energy that would be held in your gas tank would be too much for your car to process in one big burst. It would just blow up. You kind of have a similar issue happening with the energy that electrons can give off during cellular respiration. So rather than giving it off in one big burst that the cell can't really handle, it's going to give it off in small mini bursts as it gets passed down an electron transport chain. Okay, which again, similar to how gas burns in an engine. All right. Okay, so we've been looking at electrons. NADH, FADH2 are both oxidized when they come to the electron transport chain. They drop off their electrons. Those electrons get passed down from one carrier to another, like hot potato, giving off small amounts of energy at a time. Okay, I'm going to leave them sitting there for a minute because we're going to go back up here to what happens to the protons that got dropped off as well. To look at the proton gradient, we have to look at diffusion again, remembering that molecules like to go from where it's really crowded to where it's not really crowded, to where it's less crowded. Remembering that they flow down a concentration gradient when they do that. Okay, well, we have the energy that's given off by these electrons being used to push these hydrogen protons from the inside of the mitochondrial membrane to the outside. Okay, like it's the membrane in between. So this is the inner membrane, like it says right here. And then up here would be the outer membrane, and this is the space in between them. So we've got hydrogen protons being pumped from inside the membrane to the space in between the membranes. We have to use energy from the electrons to do this because guess what? They don't want to go out here. It's crowded. There's a lot of hydrogen protons. They're not happy about it, okay? Once the gradient forms, these hydrogen protons want to get back in. They want to come back to the party. And they do that by following their concentration gradient and diffusing from where it's really crowded to where it's less crowded. But the only way back in is through this back door called an ATP synthase. The ATP synthase is kind of like a turnstile. If you've ever had to walk through a ticket booth and it turns when you walk through it to count you, to count people, it acts like that. And as it turns, it's going to assemble ATP. So it takes a phosphate and it adds it to our ADP to make ATP. So as our synthase turns, it hooks a phosphate to an ADP, and that's where we get our ATP from. Okay? Well, good news. The electrons will follow one. This electron has reached the bottom of the chain, and a hydrogen has come back through the ATP synthase. What happens to those? Remember that our cells don't waste things. Everything gets tied up in a neat little bow. And it gets tied up in a neat little bow because of oxygen. Remember I told you that this is why we breathe? This is why we breathe. Oxygen has to be at the end of the electron transport chain as the final electron acceptor. When the electron is done playing hot potato, it has to get picked up by oxygen. See the skull and crossbones? This is where cyanide interacts. Is there an extra A there? Isn't that funny? Now that I have to think about it, I don't know how to spell it. Anyway, cyanide, the poison, that's where it's going to come in, is right here. Because it's going to block the reaction that allows oxygen to pick up the electrons. And so you die. And again, depending on the quantities, you can die very quickly and very painfully. If oxygen isn't here, you die. like not being dramatic, it's just the truth. If you're not breathing and oxygen isn't getting here, you're going to die. Not just because you're not breathing, but because this process of cellular respiration stops. The electrons back up in the chain because there's nothing to pick it up at the end. And then this backs up into the citric acid cycle, into pyruvic acid grooming, into glycolysis until everything shuts down. Shuts down, you end up with no ATP production, you end up with cell death, tissue death, organ death, and then the whole organism dies, right? So anything that's causing you not to breathe will prevent this process of cellular respiration from happening and ultimately kill you. Kind of crazy to think about, because we often are like, if you can't breathe, if you're choking, if you're drowning, if you're suffocating, something truly awful, right? It's all about that need to get air to the lungs. And it is, but that's not all it's about, because that oxygen that gets into your lungs has this job. It has this job to keep your body functioning. All of those little life functions that happen on the cellular level have to have oxygen right here to make it happen, okay? This is the point of cellular respiration. This and the energy to make it happen. All right, so the electrons are gonna get picked up by the oxygen that's sitting here. And then the hydrogens, protons, that were hanging out after they come back through the synthase are also gonna get picked up by oxygen. Nifty, neat little bow called water. Remember, that was our other byproduct, carbon dioxide and water. Well, there's the water. And there you have the life of an electron. A lot, right? It's a lot, but it's a cool process because of everything that happens. I'm gonna go over this one more time, okay? We're gonna do electrons first. Electrons brought in by electron carriers, NADH and FADH2. They drop their electrons off and are oxidized to form NAD+ and FAD, which go back to other steps in cellular respiration. The electrons that have been dropped off are passed to other electron carriers in a crazy electron game of hot potato, because who doesn't play hot potato at a party, huh? Crazy electron game of hot potato, giving off small amounts of energy at a time. That energy is used to pump the hydrogen protons across into the inner membrane space. When the electron is done at the end of its hot potato game, it gets picked up by oxygen, okay? There you go. Hydrogens, I've already said that the energy from the electrons going down the chain gets used to push the hydrogen protons to the intermembrane space, and this forms a proton gradient. The protons are not happy to be out here because it's super crowded and they got kicked out of the party. Not happy about this. They want back in the party. The only way to get it back in the party is to go through the ATP synthase, which is kind of like the back door. They're going to go through the back door, and when they do, they turn this little turnstile here, our ATP synthase, which attaches a phosphate to an ADP molecule, which gives us ATP. The hydrogen proton then also gets picked up by the oxygen to form water. There you go. If I had a mic, I'd drop it. That's what's happening here. This process creates, depending on the fuel source, it can generate between 28 and 30 ATP. Just in the electron transport chain, okay? Let's think about that. Glycolysis gave us, how many? How many did we get out of glycolysis net? We got 2, right? The citric acid cycle gave us 2, 1 from each turn. That is nothing compared to this huge amount that we get from the electron transport chain, okay? That's why the electron transport chain and oxygen and breathing are so important, because this is where we get most of our energy. One more slide to show you. Talked about what happens if there's not oxygen. If there's not oxygen, but you're not dying, but say you've been working out really hard and you have burned through your oxygen, You're breathing, you're healthy, but your cells are using the oxygen in cellular respiration faster than your oxygen can be replaced, okay? So what happens then is something called lactic acid fermentation. This is an anaerobic process. Remember that anaerobic means it doesn't require oxygen. Okay, there's only one step in cellular respiration that didn't need oxygen. Do you remember what it was? It's the first one, glycolysis. Okay, so you have oxygen coming in, you're working out hard, you're burning through that oxygen really fast. So the cells that aren't getting enough oxygen are going to be using lactic acid fermentation to still make some ATP. We have our glucose, goes through glycolysis. Instead of taking our pyruvates and going into pyruvic acid grooming though, the pyruvates get converted into something called lactic acid, okay? The electron carriers are going to stay within the system of glycolysis. And again, this all happens in the cytoplasm. Remember that the other steps of cellular respiration happen in the mitochondria where oxygen can be processed. All right, so lactic acid, hence the name lactic acid fermentation. Lactic acid is one of the things that builds up in your muscles after strenuous exercise, and one of the things that causes muscle aches and pains after that exercise. Lactic acid can't be broken down in our muscles. It actually has to be shipped to the liver, to be broken down there. And that's why muscle aches can last, why they encourage massage and movement and things like that to kind of help move that lactic acid out of the muscle so it can be processed elsewhere in the body. All right, how many ATP did we get out of glycolysis? 2, right? Here's our 2 ATP. Now let's say that you're not just out of oxygen because you've been exercising. Let's say that you're in one of those traumatic situations and it's life-threatening. Well, your body kicks over into lactic acid fermentation. It does. All those cells will start trying to produce ATP this way. But you're only getting 2 ATP, right? Instead of, what did I do, 28 to 30? So instead of our 32 to 36 ATP that comes out of the whole process of cellular respiration. And this number changes. Sometimes you'll see it as 32 to 34 because it depends on the fuel source. What we've gone over is using glucose as a fuel source. Okay, so again, you can see why if you're dying because you're not getting oxygen, the body can't be sustained because it's only getting 2 ATP versus this huge number that it actually requires in order to survive. Okay, all right. Let's go through this. All right. I'm just going to talk through this one more time. Are you tired of hearing it yet? I'm going to go from start to finish just through the steps. We're going to start with carbons. Remember, we're going to follow the carbons. So we have step 1 in cellular respiration, and that's glycolysis, which means splitting sugar. We have our big 6-carbon glucose molecule that's too big for the cell to use without splitting into smaller sizes. So in order to do this, we go through glycolysis, which uses 2 ATP to break our 6-carbon glucose in half. Once they're broken in half, we end up with 2 3-carbon pyruvates. And we also end up with 2 ATP. We actually made 4, but we had to pay ourselves back for the 2 that we used up front. So we get a net of 2. Those 2 3-carbon pyruvates are going to go here into pyruvic acid grooming. Here's our 3-carbon pyruvates right over here. Remember that this is where we first see our electron carrier, our Uber, NAD+. NAD+ picks up electrons, which reduces it to NADH. We know now that the NADH is going to go to the party of the electron transport chain. While this is happening, we've also lost a carbon, okay, to form carbon dioxide, one of the products of cellular respiration. So we've gone from our 3-carbon pyruvate to now only having 2 carbons. In addition to losing electrons and a carbon, we're going to gain a coenzyme called coenzyme A. That gives us a 2-carbon molecule called acetyl-CoA. That acetyl-CoA is going to go here to the citric acid cycle. Remember that it comes in, come here, right here. The coenzyme A has done its job. It started this reaction, so it's going to drop off, and it's going to go back to pyruvic acid grooming, leaving just these 2 carbons. These 2 carbons get picked up by a 4-carbon compound called oxaloacetate. Oxaloacetate plus these 2 from acetic acid form another 6-carbon compound called citric acid. It loses a carbon to form a 5-carbon compound, lose another carbon to get a 4-carbon compound, then another 4-carbon compound until we circle back to oxaloacetate again, which is going to pick up the next 2 carbons coming in from pyruvic acid grooming, and it will start over. That's the end of where we're going to follow the carbons. Come on, voice, you can do it. Okay, now we're going to look at electrons. We already know that we have electrons going to the electron transport chain from pyruvic acid grooming. And now we're going to have them again. We have both Uber and Lift in this process. We have our NAD plus here, here, and here, and our FAD plus down here at the bottom. Okay, or FAD, sorry. Those are all going to get reduced to form NADH and FADH2. And they're going to take all of their electron passengers to the party at the electron transport chain. We get 1 ATP per turn of the citric acid cycle. Okay, let's follow the electrons. Electrons here in the electron transport chain. Here's our electron carriers. Here's Uber, NADH. Here's Lift, FADH2. They drop their electrons off here along with hydrogen protons, right? Because the electrons and the protons are traveling together as hydrogen. So it's going to drop those off, and they become oxidized back to NAD plus and FAD, and then they go back to the earlier parts of cellular respiration to pick up more electrons. Following those electrons, once they get dropped off, they're going to move down the electron transport chain from one electron carrier to another in what we've described as our party game of hot potato, giving off little bits of energy as we go. At the very end of the electron transport chain, it gets picked up by oxygen, which gets there through the air we take into our lungs, that then travels through our bloodstream to be delivered here to the cells to pick up these electrons. The energy used, or the energy given off by these electrons in this process, is used to push the hydrogen protons out of the inside to the inner membrane space. Hydrogen has to be forced out there using this energy from the electrons because it's crowded, and it doesn't naturally want to go from where it's not crowded to where it's crazy crowded. Plus, they've been kicked out of the party and they're not real happy about it. So now we have this this proton gradient happening out here. They want back into the party and they want to get where it's not as crowded. So they're going to go down their concentration gradient passively, and they're going to go through the back door or the ATP synthase. The ATP synthase is like a little turnstile, and it's going to turn as the protons flow back down through it. When it turns, it assembles ATP, and it does that by adding a phosphate, which is present already in the cell, to an ADP molecule. And then of course we end up with ATP. Well, just like the electron got picked up by oxygen at the end of the transport chain, the hydrogen is also going to get picked up by oxygen, and what we end up with is water. Okay? That's the end. That is the end of cellular respiration. As always, if you have questions, especially after trying to watch all these, and if you haven't been real comfortable with how it's come together for you, please reach out to me. This is on your midterm, which is coming up soon. It's a big deal, okay? So if you are struggling, reaching out to me sooner rather than later is a good idea, okay? All right, I will see you for photosynthesis soon.